Berlin, April, 1945. Spring should have filled the streets with flowers, laughter, and strolls through the Tiergarten, but the season had arrived without colors, without birdsong, without a future. Over the city hung a strange silence, broken only by the constant rumble of Soviet guns a few kilometers from the center. It was the sound of the end drawing closer step by step, an implacable tide that erased borders and certainties. The blackened facades of the buildings leaned as if listening, fearfully, to the echo of their own ruin. In the squares, fallen trees blended with the remains of charred trams, and among the ruins, human shadows could still be seen moving with resignation. Berlin did not sleep. It could not. It was the last night before the world, as they knew it, went dark forever. Meanwhile, under that moonless sky, millions of thoughts crossed in the darkness. The soldiers who still defended the capital knew the front had broken. Civilians hid in damp basements hoping to survive one more day. And yet there was something profoundly human in that waiting. A drive to keep breathing, to light a candle in the midst of disaster, to try to keep children from noticing the fear. It was the final pulse of a city that refused to disappear. Before continuing, I'm very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you're joining us tonight. I'd love to read you in the comments. This is a journey through time, and you are part of it, accompanying us through the final hours of a city on the edge of the abyss. Imagine you walk with us through those devastated streets. The air smells of ash and smoke. Dust from the rubble floats like a thick fog. In the shattered shop windows, you can still make out propaganda posters, smiling faces promising victories that never came. A radio, abandoned on a smashed window ledge, emits a faint voice repeating slogans no one believes anymore. It is a spectral Berlin, half real, half memory, where life and death cross at every corner. The clocks keep marking the hours, but no one knows if time is moving forward or standing still. In the underground shelters, the city breathes differently. Families gather around a kerosene lamp. The concrete walls sweat damp, and the echo of explosions makes bodies vibrate. In one corner, a woman prays in silence. In another, a man tries to tune a radio to catch some news from outside. The smallest sleep on improvised blankets, clinging to their toys. Outside, stray dogs flee the gunfire. The subway trains, turned into shelters, have stopped forever. Berliners, exhausted, no longer expect miracles, only a dawn. The feeling of unreality is so dense it can almost be touched. Many still refuse to believe that the Reich, that empire proclaimed eternal, is about to disappear. Others, however, know it with a painful certainty. They have seen the refugee convoys, heard the stories of rape and looting, understood that the war no longer has direction. The streets of the West are filled with abandoned cars, bikes without wheels, furniture dragged onto sidewalks to raise useless barricades. Every building seems a mute witness to what was and what will never be again. High in the sky, searchlights cross in erratic beams. For years they were symbols of pride and defense. Now they seem to be looking for something lost, a hope, a sign that all this has not been in vain. The sirens no longer sound with the urgency of before. There are hardly any safe shelters left. Hospitals are overwhelmed, hospital trains cannot depart, and doctors operate by candlelight. Even so, there is a strange order amid the chaos. The Germans, accustomed to discipline to the end, continue fulfilling what little remains of their routines, cleaning hallways, sharing bread, trying to keep calm. That discipline, once the engine of the regime, now becomes its most human form of resistance. If we close our eyes, we can hear the murmur of half-voiced conversations. A mother tells her child that tomorrow everything will be better. A soldier whispers to his comrade that reinforcements will arrive soon, though he knows it's a lie. Deep down, everyone understands this is the last night. They don't say it, but they feel it. Every second stretches as if time itself were afraid to move toward the inevitable. The clocks keep marking the hours, yes, but each tick-tock sounds like a countdown. And yet, even in this final hour, there are glimmers of tenderness. In the devastated parks, some couples walk hand in hand. They share a cigarette, a glance, a memory of brighter times. In a basement in the Mitte district, an old woman plays a melody on an out-of-tune piano while a group of neighbors listens in silence. The music floats among them like an invisible refuge, a reminder that beauty, even at the end of the world, can survive a few minutes more. Outside, shells fall without rest, but in that small corner underground, the melody sounds louder than the war. The few who still move on the surface do so like ghosts. Lost soldiers, messengers without destination, old men searching for food among the rubble. Power poles are twisted, telephone lines cut. Berlin has become a city of shadows and echoes. Every corner holds a story, every window a secret. If one stops for a moment, you can feel the city breathing, but no longer with the rhythm of life, rather with the slow gasp of one who is dying. At the heart of it all, under tons of concrete and steel, hides the Chancellery bunker. There, the figure who for 12 years dominated Europe lives his own sunset. Hitler turns 56 years old that very day, while on the surface his Reich burns. Outside, no one celebrates. No one sings. No one dares believe the promises of a leader who has lost contact with reality. In that armored basement, orders are dictated in a trembling voice. Maps fill with lines that no longer mean anything, and the air thickens with cigarette smoke. The end can be felt even there, in the heart of power. The contrast between that bunker and the ravaged streets is brutal. While the dictator shuts himself in his own delusion, the people face the truth with silent dignity. No one knows exactly when the war will end, but all feel the outcome is very near. The bombs do not stop, the fires do not die, and the entire city seems to hold together only out of habit. In that endless night, the line between hope and resignation blurs. Perhaps the most overwhelming thing is that, despite everything, Berlin is still a living city. Wounded, mutilated, but alive. In the shadows, there are still those who heal, help, console. In the midst of hell, humanity does not entirely go out. Perhaps that is what makes this story more than a tragedy. It proves that even when the world collapses, human beings find a way to keep looking ahead, even if only to see the sunrise once more. And as the clock marks the last hours of April 20th, a reddish light gleams on the horizon. It is not the sun, but the fire of burning buildings. Berlin's night is just beginning, and with it, the end of an era. Because beneath those ruins, something deeper is about to crumble, the very myth of power. The dawn of April 20th, 1945 came without birdsong. Only the rumble of Soviet artillery announced that the day had begun. Sunlight barely managed to filter through the fog and smoke that covered Berlin, and each glint seemed to reflect off the broken glass like a deformed mirror of the past. In that gray, suspended atmosphere, the clocks marked the hour of a birthday that no longer meant anything. In the bunker of the Reich Chancellery, beneath meters of concrete and steel, Adolf Hitler turned 56. The man who had promised 1,000 years of glory to the German people received his last congratulations in a world reduced to narrow corridors, flickering lights, and the metallic echo of bombs falling on the city he claimed to love. The scene inside the bunker had something surreal about it. Witnesses of that day described a mix of formality and defeat. Officers entered in line to greet the Führer, some with uniforms stained with mud and blood, others with the vacant look of those who no longer believe in the orders they repeat out of habit. Hitler, gaunt, moving slowly, extended his hand with an automatic gesture. His fingers trembled, His voice was a harsh whisper. Nothing remained of the charismatic orator of the 30s, nor of the strategist who moved armies with board-like precision. There was only a sick man, trapped in his own underground fortress, surrounded by the last faithful who treated him more like a specter than a leader. On the surface, the situation was another story. Berlin was completely surrounded. From the east, Marshal Zhukov's troops advanced without rest. From the south, Konev's forces closed the ring. Soviet guns had reached the urban limits, and with each passing day, the German lines fell back a few meters more. In the northern districts, streets filled with displaced civilians, and field hospitals were overwhelmed. The noise of the fighting was constant, a deep, unceasing murmur, like thunder that never dies. Yet amid that chaos, propaganda kept insisting victory was possible. Loudspeakers repeated slogans that sounded hollow even to the most loyal. "The Führer still trusts in the salvation of Berlin," a female voice said on a state radio, while on the other side of the glass, a mother wrapped her child to protect him from the cold, seeping through the cracks of the shelter. Berliners knew it. The war was lost. They felt it in the air, in the lack of food, in the empty expressions of soldiers patrolling the streets with rusty rifles. Despite this, there was something stubbornly orderly in their routine. Women still went to ration points, workers repaired power lines, and in basements they still organized shifts to clean the dust from the bombings. That silent obedience was a mix of instinct and resignation, a way to keep existing when everything around collapses. It was not hope. It was a form of dignity. Inside the bunker, officers exchanged looks that said more than any report. They knew the war was over, but none dared to speak the word surrender. Joseph Goebbels, minister of propaganda and Hitler's inseparable shadow, tried to maintain a combative spirit with delirious speeches about the heroic sacrifice of the German people. His wife Magda walked the children through the narrow corridors, convinced that dying beside the Führer would be an act of faith and not of madness. Beyond, Eva Braun, Hitler's silent lover, smiled at others with an almost theatrical serenity, as if she wanted to be remembered that way, radiant and calm, in the heart of the apocalypse. No one spoke of fleeing. No one dared imagine a future after that confinement. The hours stretched. The air in the bunker grew heavy, steeped in smoke, sweat, and fear. Reports arrived constantly. The Eastern Front was falling apart. Enemy tanks could already be seen from rooftops downtown. Hitler, according to his secretary's accounts, spent long minutes in silence before the maps, moving markers with trembling hands. He spoke of non-existent divisions, of impossible counteroffensives. His mind seemed to have detached from reality, taking refuge in a past he could no longer change. At times he muttered that the German people had betrayed him, that if the nation fell, it deserved destruction. Those words, spoken in the gloom of the command room, sounded like an epitaph. Meanwhile, on the surface, the people tried to find meaning in survival. In improvised subway shelters, civilians shared hard bread and water with a taste of rust. Children, too young to understand, drew airplanes and intact houses with charcoal on the walls. Some believed the Western Allies would arrive first, that Berlin would be occupied by the British or Americans before the Soviets. That illusion repeated from mouth to mouth like a charm. But the explosions thundering from the east were ever closer, and the army reports ever more desperate. In the afternoon, the German High Command met once more in the bunker. Conversations went in circles. Some asked to evacuate the city. Others demanded resistance to the last man. Goebbels insisted that the sacrifice of Berlin would be the eternal symbol of German valor. But no one could ignore the truth. The army no longer existed as such. What remained were battalions of teenagers forcibly recruited, militiamen armed with outdated rifles, and veterans who could barely stand. Every bullet was counted. Every tank lost was another blow to national pride. And still, the Führer ordered resistance. Resist even if there were no soldiers, no munitions, no hope. Outside, Berliners listened to conflicting rumors. Some believed Hitler had fled to the Bavarian mountains. Others said he was preparing a secret weapon capable of changing the course of the war. No one knew the truth. Reality was much more banal. The Führer remained locked in his refuge, trapped by the same fear he had instilled for years. The fear of failure, of humiliation, of history's judgment. His followers knew it, but kept silent. Silence had become the common language of that last day. Night came early, as if the sky itself refused to witness what was happening. In the streets, fires gave the city a reddish glow, almost unreal. The reflections of the flames slipped through the cracks of shelters, tinting children's faces with a ghostly shine. Sometimes, amid the roar of bombs, the distant peal of a bell could be heard. No one knew where it came from. Perhaps from some church still standing. Perhaps from the memory of a more innocent time. Berlin burned, but it kept beating. That night, while the Führer shut himself in his rooms and most of his officers slept with pistols under their pillows, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the west, a group of musicians improvised an accordion on a corner, playing an old melody that spoke of farewells. In another shelter, a mother turned off her lamp and told her child that soon it would all be over. No one knew what over meant exactly. For some, it would be surrender. For others, death. But the same feeling floated for all, that of living inside a dream that could no longer hold. At the next dawn, Soviet troops would advance even further, and the walls of power would begin to crack from within. The exhausted city would keep resisting out of sheer inertia, while the echo of the empire that promised to last 1,000 years faded among smoke and rubble. Because when an empire falls, it does not do so at once. First, its voice goes out. In the depths of Berlin, under tons of concrete and dust, the war had another sound. It wasn't cannons or tank engines, but a constant murmur. Breathing, sighs, the clink of a cup, the stifled cry of a child. The air raid shelters had become the last redoubt of civilian life, an underground city where thousands shared the same darkness, the same fear, the same unanswered question. How much longer could they endure? Every basement, every subway station, every abandoned tunnel was a world apart. Some were so crowded there was hardly room to sit. Others stayed in half-light, occupied by families accustomed to the smell of damp and the tremor of the walls. Candles were treasures, and the air grew denser with each passing night. In the U-Bahn tunnels, where Berliners once hurried to work, hundreds now slept on improvised blankets. Low voices carried news of what remained outside. They say the Russians have already crossed the Spree. At the hospital on Friedrichstrasse, there isn't a single doctor left. Short phrases, laden with resignation that faded as quickly as they were born. There was something deeply human in that shared silence. It wasn't just fear. It was a form of communion. No one asked which side the other was on, nor who had been a soldier, or who had believed in the regime. Underground, all ideologies dissolved into the most basic instinct: survival. A mother offered a stranger a piece of hard bread. An old man told stories of the First World War to distract the children. A young soldier, his arm bandaged, stared at the ceiling with distant eyes, wondering if the world above his head would still exist at dawn. Accounts of those who lived through that experience speak of a darkness that was not only physical. Down there, a woman named Lieselotte Meyer would recall years later, we didn't know if it was day or night. We only heard the explosions and hoped it wasn't our house falling this time. The shelter smelled of metal, diesel, and tired bodies. Water was scarce and the air stale. In some, electric fans had stopped for lack of power, and people fanned themselves with pieces of cardboard just to breathe. Children cried in silence, exhausted. Adults had no strength left to console them. Even so, even in that hell, there were moments of tenderness. In one of the shelters at Alexanderplatz, a young woman played an old harmonica whenever the thunder of bombs became unbearable. The melody, simple and melancholy, traveled through the tunnel like a thread of hope. Some closed their eyes, imagining they were far away, on a summer afternoon, in a place where war was only a bad dream. The music, fleeting but warm, made them forget the fear for an instant. It was these small gestures that kept the idea of humanity alive when everything else seemed lost. Rumors also lived in the shelters, almost a kind of currency. It was said the Allies were at the gates, that Hitler had fled, that the Soviets shot all the men they found. Every story found ears ready to believe it, because the truth in those days had become too painful. Words ran from mouth to mouth, warping, mixing hope with terror. No one knew what was real and what wasn't. In the darkness, any phrase could turn into truth. Some still tried to keep up appearances of normality. In certain shelters, shifts were organized to cook with what little remained: potatoes, stale bread, boiled water. Older women recited prayers or folk songs for the youngest. Others simply stayed silent, listening to the distant rumble of combat, as if they wanted to measure the end of the world by sound. Every explosion that didn't reach them was a reprieve granted by fate. Underground, time blurred. There were no clocks or sunrises, only a succession of sounds: footsteps, sobs, the roar of planes, the shudder of beams. Above, the Red Army advanced through the northern districts, but down there people no longer thought about politics or defeat. They had left behind the ideas of homeland and glory. They thought only of the present, of surviving, of finding water, of not losing their minds. Fear turned into routine, and routine into a form of resistance. There were also those who lost hope completely. Some shelters filled with a silence so deep it seemed a collective renunciation. The eldest spoke of waiting for the end with dignity. Others, younger, still dreamed of escape, of reaching the western zone before the Soviets occupied the city. But with each passing day, those hopes crumbled, like the buildings above their heads. Despite everything, the shelters became the most honest witnesses to the fall of the Third Reich. There, with stark clarity, the final consequence of ambition and lies was reflected. Promises of eternal glory had been reduced to a handful of bodies trembling underground, surrounded by dust and darkness. The slogans that once filled the squares no longer made sense in the face of a child's tears or an old man's cough. War had ceased to be ideology to become pure human suffering. In some tunnels, cracks began to let in water from the River Spree. The walls dampened, the floors turned to mud, and the smallest played without understanding that the water brought an invisible danger. In subway stations, abandoned carriages served as dormitories. Windows were broken, seats covered with blankets. The air smelled of soot and despair. Yet sometimes, amid the noise, someone told a joke, an absurd anecdote, and people laughed. They laughed with a weak, fragile sound, but real. It was a way to tell fear it hadn't won yet. A nurse who worked in a shelter in the Moabit district wrote in her diary, "I've learned that courage isn't in the one who fires, but in the one who calms a child during a bombing." Those words, written with trembling ink, sum up what life underground was: a mix of horror and tenderness, of despair and dignity. There, where the world collapsed above their heads, Berliners discovered that heroism had nothing to do with a flag, but with the ability to keep breathing together. And when the roar became too strong, when the ground shook and dust fell from the ceiling like gray rain, they all looked at each other in silence, waiting for it to pass. Some prayed, others closed their eyes. Time stopped. Then, the noise ceased, and for a few seconds no one dared to speak. It was then that the clearest voices were heard, those from the underground, from those still alive. Broken voices, but steady. Voices that said, "We're still here." Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of those nights. That even in the abyss, human beings find ways to recognize one another, to hold each other up without words. Berlin, the capital of an empire that was collapsing, kept beating underground, invisible but present, with every shared breath. And on the surface, far above those silent galleries, tanks were already beginning to appear on the Spree's bridges, marking the next chapter of that foretold end. Because while the city shielded itself below ground, above it the final battle was being prepared. On the surface, while thousands of civilians took refuge underground, the city became a board of ruins where any corner could be the last. The Red Army had already crossed Berlin's limits, and the echo of combat resounded everywhere. Shots ricocheted between shattered walls, and the avenues that once symbolized German grandeur were now covered with rubble, burning tanks, and bodies no one collected. It was the spring of 1945, but nothing bloomed over Berlin. Only smoke, ash, and a persistent cold that seeped into the bones. The soldiers who still defended the capital were, for the most part, not soldiers. They were teenagers, old men, and civilians armed with outdated rifles, conscripted by force in the Reich's final months. That improvised army bore the name Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a desperate attempt by Hitler to prolong the inevitable. Many of those youths were not yet 16, others were over 60. They had been promised glory, but what they found was a city in ruins and an enemy advancing with the force of an unstoppable tide. Picture the scene. A boy with a beardless face, in a uniform too big for him, hides behind a barricade made of furniture and stones. In his hands, he holds a Panzerfaust, an anti-tank rocket launcher he barely knows how to use. Beside him, a veteran of the Great War teaches him to breathe slowly, to wait for the right moment to fire. They don't talk much. Words are superfluous when fear fills everything. From their position, they can see the flash of Soviet tanks approaching along Unter den Linden. Each explosion makes the ground shudder, and the boy feels the earth tremble beneath his feet. He knows he won't leave there, but he still squeezes the trigger with the resolve of someone taught never to surrender. That mix of naivety and desperation marked the last days of fighting. Volkssturm units deployed in disorganized groups, defending isolated blocks, trading fire with entire divisions of the Red Army. The resistance was heroic in appearance, but futile in reality. On many streets, fighting raged house by house, floor by floor. Soviet soldiers advanced with flamethrowers and grenades. The Germans responded with pistols, with knives, with whatever they had at hand. The air filled with smoke and dust. Each shot, each scream, seemed to swallow the silence of the underground shelters. Berlin had become a labyrinth of destruction. Bridges over the River Spree had been blown by the Germans to slow the enemy's advance, but the effect was the opposite. The city was left fragmented, cut off, plunged into chaos. Trucks could not pass, ambulances could not reach the wounded, and isolated troops lost contact with command. Some commanders improvised radios with wires and batteries. Others sent messengers on foot, aware that many would not return. The war had lost all coordination, reduced to a succession of desperate gestures. In the center, near the Brandenburg Gate, the last German tanks tried to hold out. The Müncheberg Panzer Division, formed in the final months of the conflict, fought with vehicles that could barely move for lack of fuel. Many tanks were used as static fortifications, half buried in the ground. Their crews, exhausted youths, knew there were no reinforcements or supplies, but still followed orders. For every shot they received, they answered with another, even though the enemy outnumbered them 10-1. Sometimes the fighting was so close that soldiers could see the adversary's face before dying. Propaganda kept insisting that resistance was a sacred duty. Posters on the walls spoke of heroism, of defending the capital of the Reich to the last breath. But in practice, what existed was fear. Fear of dying, fear of surrendering, fear of their own officers who punished any attempt at retreat. In some districts, SS patrols executed on the spot those who refused to fight. Children, old men, women. No one was safe from a regime's obsession that preferred collective suicide to admitting defeat. And yet, despite the horror, there are accounts that speak of humanity amid the chaos. A military doctor treating the wounded in an improvised hospital in Moabit wrote, "None of them fight for Hitler. They fight for each other, for the comrade at their side, to reach the end of the day together." That phrase captures the paradox of those last soldiers. They obeyed orders born of madness, but their acts were guided by something much more elemental, almost fraternal. They did not fight for an ideal, but out of the simple instinct to protect the one breathing next to them. Berlin's most symbolic streets turned into battlefields. On Wilhelmstrasse, trees burned like torches. At the Reichstag, the Soviets raised barricades with the bodies of the fallen. At Potsdamer Platz, buildings collapsed one after another under artillery fire. Sounds mixed. The roar of engines, screams, the hiss of bullets, and above all, the smell. The smell of gunpowder, metal, smoke. Those who survived those days said Berlin smelled like the end of the world. At night, when the fire eased a little, some fighters took shelter in basements or subway stations. There they crossed paths with civilians, with women and children who looked at their uniforms with a mix of compassion and fear. No one said much. Some shared cigarettes, others simply sat, staring at nothing. The young soldiers wondered how it was possible that the world had shrunk to a handful of streets, to a sky covered in fire. On their faces there was more sadness than fury. Perhaps deep down, they knew they were defending a corpse. The dawn of April 25th marked a point of no return. The Red Army managed to encircle the city completely, and German divisions were cut off. Berlin no longer had contact with the outside. Phone lines were severed, planes could not land, supplies ran out. The siege was total. The Soviets advanced slowly, block by block, while the Germans fell back toward the center, trying to form a perimeter around the Führer's bunker. What remained of the Wehrmacht was an army of shadows, exhausted, drenched in mud and blood, sustained only by the habit of obedience. Amid that hell, some soldiers still wrote letters, small scraps of paper with simple messages. "I'm alive. I don't know for how long." None of those letters ever reached their destination. They were buried under the rubble, like the voices of those who wrote them. On April 26th, Soviet tanks burst through Alexanderplatz, and the fighting intensified. German resistance, though fierce, no longer had military meaning. Every minute gained only prolonged the agony. Soviet commanders, aware of this, offered partial surrenders. Some groups accepted. Others preferred to die in their positions. Thus Berlin, that city that once symbolized absolute power, became an open cemetery, where ideals had vanished and only bodies and dust remained. Berlin's last soldiers no longer fought for a flag. They fought because they didn't know how to do anything else. They fought because the alternative, surrender, seemed as unbearable as death. And among the rubble, among the screams and the fire, they kept falling, one by one, like leaves swept by the wind. When night fell over the city again, the fire lit the blackened faces of the fighters. Berlin burned, but it kept breathing. The guns of the Reichstag fired for the last time, and in the shelters, families listened to the distant rumble, not knowing whether the sound meant victory or defeat. Because while the surface burned in flames, beneath the ground the whispers of power collapsing began to be heard. While on the surface Berlin burned and fractured into thousands of scattered skirmishes, underground, almost 10 meters deep, another world was slowly sinking. It was the Führerbunker, the nervous center of the regime, the last refuge of absolute power. Its existence had been conceived years earlier as an impregnable fortress, a symbol of control even in the face of apocalypse. But in April 1945, that closed. Gray space was no longer a bunker, but a premature tomb. The air was dense, almost unbreathable. The walls were covered in condensation. The damp mixed with the smell of sweat, cigar smoke, gasoline, and fear. In the corridors, lights flickered due to power cuts. The generators failed often, and the fans barely moved the air. In that claustrophobic atmosphere, the clock seemed to mark the time of another reality, one in which the past still fought to deny its end. Adolf Hitler lived secluded in the core of the complex, accompanied by his closest circle: Eva Braun, Josef and Magda Goebbels, Martin Bormann, General Krebs, and a few personal aides. The routine was always the same. Early in the morning, the Führer met with his officers in the map room, where they analyzed reports that no longer served any purpose. The defensive lines shown in the documents had ceased to exist days earlier, but no one dared tell him plainly. Each meeting was a ritual of denial, a macabre choreography in which all pretended there was still a plan, a possibility, a way out. Testimonies from those who were there agree on one detail: Hitler had ceased to be the man who dominated with voice and gaze. His body was deteriorated, his left hand trembled constantly, and he walked in short steps, shuffling his feet. He slept little, ate less. His face, pale and sunken, was the reflection of a decomposed empire. At times he spoke in fury, pounding the table with his fist. At others, he remained in silence, staring into the void for long minutes. Between one outburst and another, he blamed everyone: the generals, the German people, the Allies, fate. He said the people had failed the Führer, and not the other way around. Eva Braun, meanwhile, tried to maintain an appearance of normality. She dressed elegantly, smiled, listened to music on a small record player she had brought with her. She organized small dinners, served wine, laughed with the few who still had the spirit to do so. It was as if she refused to accept that the end was approaching, as if she wanted to turn that confinement into a kind of final dance before the abyss. "All I desire," she said on one occasion, "is to die beside the man I love." Her words, spoken in a light tone, provoked an uncomfortable silence among those present. Magda Goebbels, by contrast, lived consumed by a mixture of fanaticism and sadness. In the corridors, she was seen walking with her small children, 6 youngsters with serene, innocent faces who did not understand what was happening. At times, she carefully combed them, read them stories, tucked them into their room, pretending everything remained the same. But in her gaze, one could sense something darker: the decision not to allow them a future without National Socialism. That idea, absurd and tragic, grew in silence, fed by blind devotion to Hitler and the certainty that the outside world would show no mercy. The atmosphere in the bunker grew more tense as the days advanced. The explosions outside could be heard clearly, ever closer. The trembling of the ground made cups and plates in the kitchen vibrate. Conversations were reduced to whispers, and military reports spoke only of losses. Hitler received news of units that had never existed, of divisions supposedly on the way. Some officers, so as not to contradict him, humored him. Others, exhausted, kept quiet. No one dared speak the word all were thinking: defeat. There were moments of delirium. In one such meeting, Hitler ordered an imaginary offensive, convinced that General Steiner's forces would attack from the north to free the capital. When informed that Steiner had neither sufficient troops nor fuel, he exploded in rage. He shouted, insulted his own commanders, tore up documents on the table. That outburst, recorded in several testimonies, was the symbol of the final collapse. After that scene, the Führer seemed to age all at once. From that day on, his tone changed. He no longer spoke of victory, but of death. In idle hours, the bunker's occupants took refuge in everyday gestures. Some wrote letters, others drank cognac or listened to music. In a corner, a secretary cried without making a sound. No one knew how much longer the city would hold out, nor whether the Soviet army would manage to break into the bunker. Outside, gunfire was constant, the air filled with dust. At times, the youngest went up to the surface for a few minutes, seeking fresh air. What they saw was desolating. Empty streets, unburied bodies, collapsed buildings. Berlin was no longer a capital, but a sprawling cemetery. Paranoia grew by the hour. Hitler suspected everyone. He feared being betrayed, captured, displayed as a trophy. He ordered documents burned, files destroyed, any trace of his private life eliminated. Even his dogs were poisoned before the Soviets could find them. "I will not be taken alive," he said, according to his aides' recollections. The decision was made. He would die there, in his bunker, and with him, everything he had built. Amid that funereal atmosphere, history kept its course. Soviet officers had already crossed the River Spree and were advancing through the central districts. Each explosion shook the shelter's ceiling. Some corridors cracked, dust fell from the concrete, lights went out for moments. Even so, inside there was a strange calm. Hitler continued dictating orders that no one would carry out, writing messages to generals who no longer existed. It was as if time had stopped in that underworld, while above the entire world was changing. In the last days of April, the tension became unbearable. Food reserves were nearly exhausted, water was scarce. Eva Braun and Magda Goebbels shared cigarettes in silence. The guards, aware of the end, drank excessively to endure the wait. Outside, the roar of the guns was constant. Each night, the shaking of the ground made the chandeliers sway over the tables. It was a choreography of the end of the world, a final act performed by men and women who still pretended to be in control. But the truth was evident. Control had vanished long before. What remained was the shadow, the empty prolongation of a power that no longer governed anyone. The Führerbunker was the perfect symbol of that end, a concrete heart beating beneath a dying city, a fortress turned mausoleum. Hitler's last orders would be given there, in that place without windows or hope. History would soon cease to be written with words and would begin to be written with fire. Because while power locked itself underground, above the city the flames kept claiming what remained of the sky. Berlin's sky was no longer blue. By the middle of the last week of April 1945, the city burned without pause. From dawn until well into the night, columns of smoke rose over the districts as if a storm of fire had descended upon the earth. The capital of the Reich, which for a decade had been the symbol of absolute power, had become a landscape of ruins, an endless succession of buildings ripped open by bombs, streets covered in ash, anonymous bodies lying on the cobblestones. The air smelled of gunpowder and burned wood, and every breath was a mixture of fear, soot, and dust. From the air, Soviet pilots could see the flames spreading like lit veins along the boulevards, crossing bridges, devouring squares and avenues. At ground level, the scene was different. A directionless hell. Firefighters could not keep up. Water pumps were disabled, and citizens, armed with buckets and wet towels, tried to put out the fires consuming their homes. But it was useless. The flames were faster than human hands, and the capricious wind pushed them from building to building as if the fire delighted in prolonging the punishment. Witnesses described those days with a mixture of incredulity and horror. It was as if the city itself were screaming, wrote a woman in her diary, hidden in a basement in the Schöneberg district. The heat was so strong the walls sweated, and the sky turned red, completely red. That image, the blood-colored sky, was seared into the memory of an entire generation. From the shelters, Children looked through door cracks and thought they saw the sunrise. They did not know it was the glow of the fire reflected on the clouds of smoke. On the surface, the few who still walked did so like shadows. Some pushed wheelbarrows with the few belongings they had left. Others carried the wounded on boards or blankets. Improvised hospitals in schools and basements could take no more people. Medicines, bandages, even water were lacking. Nurses worked without rest, sometimes with bare hands, sometimes improvising tourniquets from strips of cloth. In the hallways, the wounded waited their turn in silence, staring at the peeling ceiling, while outside the guns kept roaring. The Soviet advance was unstoppable. From the east, tanks pushed through the districts of Friedrichshain and Lichtenberg. From the south, troops crossed the Landwehr Canal, firing at buildings where small groups of German soldiers still resisted. Each block captured cost dozens of lives. Hand-to-hand fighting became common. Stairways covered in blood, rooms filled with smoke, soldiers fighting with bayonets amid the rubble. Berlin, the great capital of the Reich, had been reduced to a handful of ruins and a multitude of souls who still refused to surrender completely. But even amid the chaos, life forced its way through in unexpected forms. A nurse recounted that, in the middle of a bombardment, a woman gave birth in the tunnel of Alexanderplatz station. Without doctors, without light, surrounded by strangers, that mother brought a child into the world while the ceiling trembled over their heads. When the newborn's cry filled the tunnel, everyone present, soldiers, elders, refugees, fell silent. It was a brief but profound instant, as if life itself claimed its right to exist even there, in the heart of hell. Outside the shelters, the landscape was apocalyptic. The avenues that once gleamed with military parades were now covered with heaps of rubble. Trams lay overturned on the rails, shop windows were smashed, statues decapitated. In Tiergarten, the great central park, trees had been felled for firewood or to open fields of fire. Fountains were dry, ponds turned to mud puddles. At night, the shadows of fires danced on the walls, casting figures that seemed to move with lives of their own. The sounds, shouts, gunfire, the crackle of flames, merged into a single constant note, a deep roar that seemed to come from the earth's core. The civilian population lived between despair and confusion. Some still trusted the Western Allies would arrive in time to occupy the city before the Soviets. Others simply wished it would all end, no matter who won. On street corners, regime posters still hung, though half-burned. Promises of victory, faith, resistance. Empty words the fire devoured mercilessly. Portraits of the Führer, blackened by smoke, peeled off walls and fell to the floor, covered in ash. It was the perfect metaphor for a system crumbling along with its city. In some neighborhoods, German soldiers still tried to maintain order. They escorted civilians trying to cross streets under fire, helped evacuate the wounded, or simply accompanied those who had lost everything. But even they knew resistance was a futile gesture. The enemy was everywhere, and the air smelled of defeat. A Soviet commander contemplating the burning city from a high building wrote in his diary, "Berlin looks like a gigantic oven." No one can survive that, and yet they remain there. Survivors' accounts also speak of the fear of looting. As the Red Army advanced into the central districts, many inhabitants feared reprisals. Stories of rapes, executions, and revenge spread from mouth to mouth. In the shelters, women smeared soot on their faces to appear older or ill. Some men hid their families behind false walls. The sound of Soviet boots approaching was, for many, the announcement of the end of hope. But even that fear mixed with a strange form of relief. At least, the end was near. As the days advanced, fire became the true master of the city. There was no difference between day and night, shadow and light. The glare of the flames dyed the sky orange and pink, and smoke hid the sun. From the air, Berlin looked like an endless bonfire. Each building that fell was a chapter closing. Each explosion, a final sentence written in fire. And yet, amid the disaster, something survived. Memory. Some neighbors gathered family portraits from the rubble. Others kept singed books, letters, medals, anything that might remind them a world had once existed before the ruin. It was their way of resisting oblivion, of bearing witness that not everything had been taken by the war. By nightfall on April 28th, the fire had already reached the neighborhoods near the center. From the Reichstag to the Brandenburg Gate, the air was a dense haze, and the horizon a constant glow. In the chancellery, under the ground, the bunker's occupants could feel the heat rising from the streets. The city was dying above them, a long, noisy death, while the echo of explosions seeped through the walls as if hell itself were knocking at the door. No one knew it then, but in just a few hours, the end would cease to be a possibility and become a fact. The flames were not only consuming the city, they were about to reach the very power that had lit them. Because at some point in that starless night, fire and fate began to descend toward the same place. The night of April 28th fell over Berlin like a thick veil, covering with its shadow the smoke, the flames, and hopelessness. On the surface, the fire kept burning without rest. But underground, in the heart of power, silence began to carry a different weight. It was the silence of truths no one could keep hiding. The city was lost, and everyone knew it, even those who still pretended otherwise. In the chancellery bunker, hours were measured in sighs and in orders that dissolved before being carried out. Hitler had received the news that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The Soviets had completely encircled the capital, and General Wenck's troops, his last thread of hope, would never reach Berlin. Something else, even more devastating to his mind, was also confirmed. Mussolini, his ally and ideological mirror, had been captured and executed in Italy. His body hung in a public square. On hearing the news, the Führer paled, pressed his lips, and said not a word for several minutes. Then he murmured, in a barely audible voice, that he would not allow himself to be humiliated in the same way. His fate, like everything he had controlled, would be decided by himself. From that night on, the atmosphere in the bunker changed. What had once been a refuge became a funereal sanctuary. No one believed in victory anymore, not even the most devout. Goebbels kept talking about loyalty, sacrifice, honor, but his words fell into an ever deeper void. Magda, his wife, spent more time silent, watching her children sleep. Martin Bormann, the Führer's personal secretary, continued transmitting orders to the outside, though he knew no one obeyed them. The radio messages he sent to the German High Command were like bottles cast into the sea of defeat. Hitler, locked in his office, alternated moments of fury with long periods of dejection. He talked to himself, repeated disjointed phrases about betrayal, purity, and destiny. Those around him saw him transformed. The tremor in his hands was uncontrollable. His gaze had turned opaque. He was no longer the man who had drawn multitudes. He was a specter of himself, prisoner of the very machinery he had built. At times, he leafed through old speeches, as if seeking in them an explanation or a final justification. But there were no words that could redeem the disaster. The ideology that had promised a millennium of greatness was collapsing in just a few days. And with it, the certainties of those who had believed in that myth of steel and order collapsed too. The officers who still drifted through the bunker moved like shadows. None spoke of the future, only of the end. Some wanted to die fighting, others hoped for a surrender no one dared propose. Among them, conversations were reduced to murmurs. What will we do when it's all over? Will the Russians accept a surrender? What will he do? But the question that hung in the air was always the same, though no one spoke it aloud. What will happen when the myth dies? Outside, Berlin kept burning. The fighting drew near the Brandenburg Gate. Soviet tanks could already be seen from the Chancellery Gardens. the roar of artillery mixed with the creak of collapsing walls. At times the din was so strong the ceiling lamps swayed and the walls trembled as if breathing. Each jolt reminded those inside that time was running out. The bunker was not an eternal fortress, as they had believed. It was a tomb with an expiration date. Intelligence reports arriving were ever more absurd. Some claimed Patton's forces were advancing from the west. Others, that the British were about to offer a truce. None was true. But amid decomposition, the lie was the last refuge. Many preferred to believe fictions rather than face reality. Lies in those days worked like morphine. They did not cure, but they eased for an instant. On one of those endless nights, Hitler made a decision. He gathered his closest collaborators and announced he would not leave Berlin, would not flee to the Bavarian mountains, nor surrender to the Soviets. He would die there, where it had all begun. Man can be destroyed, but not defeated if he chooses his end, he said, and for a moment his voice recovered an echo of authority. Eva Braun listened in silence, with the serene expression of one who already knew. Goebbels nodded with wet eyes, as if that declaration were a form of salvation. But the others, the ones who still kept a shred of practical sense, looked at one another in fear. They knew that once that decision was made, there was no turning back. While the Führer dictated his political and personal testament, the sounds outside seemed to synchronize with the fate being sealed within. Shells fell closer. Lights went out and returned like a blink from hell. Hitler spoke of betrayals, of internal enemies, of the purity of the National Socialist movement, of the guilt of the German people. It was his last speech, addressed not to the world, but to himself. He wanted to leave a written record of his justification, even if no one would ever read it without horror. When he finished, he signed the documents with a trembling hand. Then he leaned back in his chair and remained silent. Around him the faces were a gallery of specters. No one cried. No one spoke. In that strange stillness, what all knew became evident. The myth had broken. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him for years dissipated in that damp basement, reduced to dust, like the ruins of the city above their heads. The collapse of the Third Reich was not only military or political, but spiritual. What fell with Berlin was the idea that a man could set himself up as a god, that a nation could dominate the world by the force of a single will. That belief, sustained by millions for more than a decade, now evaporated with the smoke of the fires. The speeches, the parades, the flags, all that became a distant echo. What remained was the naked truth, the evidence that history does not forgive delusions of grandeur. Outside, the dawn of April 29th brought a momentary silence. Soviet artillery paused for a few hours to reorganize its attack. From the ruined streets, smoke could be seen rising like a thick fog over the city. No one knew how many were still alive, nor how many had died during the night. In the bunker, some still awaited orders. Others simply awaited the end. The Führer remained shut in with Eva Braun, while Goebbels wrote letters no one would read. Everything came down to that, to writing, to waiting, to sinking. At some point that morning, someone commented that perhaps the fire would purify the city, that from the ruins a new Germany would be born. But the words sounded hollow, as if they came from another life. Berlin was not ready to be reborn. It still had a bit more dying to do. Because before history closes, there is always a last act, and that act is usually written in the deepest silence. The morning of April 30th, 1945 dawned gray and silent over a city that no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Berlin was exhausted, reduced to a bundle of smoking ruins, where each breath was an act of resistance. In the central streets, fighting had diminished, not because the war had ceased, but because there were almost no men left to fight. Explosions were still heard in the distance, but more spaced out, as if even destruction had tired of itself. Beneath those shattered streets, in the damp corridors of the Führerbunker, the clock marked the end of an era. The air was heavy, saturated with smoke and anxiety. Electric generators sputtered, water seeped through cracks in the ceiling, and the smell of fuel permeated every room. Those remaining inside knew the day would not be like the others. They felt it in the atmosphere, in whispers, in clumsy gestures, and prolonged silences. It was the day when power would extinguish itself by its own hand. Adolf Hitler had risen early. He had slept only a few hours, like a condemned man counting the time he has left. He dressed in his gray uniform, impeccably pressed, and sat in his office for several minutes, staring at the floor without a word. On the table lay the documents of his political and personal testament, signed the night before. Outside, Soviet guns kept advancing, and each shot made the ceiling lamps tremble. In the hallway, muffled steps could be heard, muted conversations. No one wanted to interrupt the waiting. By mid-morning, Hitler asked to see some of those who still accompanied him. He greeted them with a calm many interpreted as resignation. He thanked them for their services, shook a few hands, murmured words no one would remember exactly. Then, according to witnesses, he briefly embraced his dog Blondie, whom he had poisoned the day before to test the cyanide's effectiveness, and ordered it taken from the office. The scene, according to one of his assistants, was more sad than solemn. He seemed like a man already dead inside, merely waiting for the body to follow. Eva Braun, dressed in a simple blue suit, was serene. She had rejected chances to flee offered by the few officers who could still escape. Her decision was unshakable: to die at his side. During breakfast, she spoke calmly, even smiled. She drank a cup of coffee, smoked a cigarette, and spoke with one of the secretaries about her wedding dress. An intimate, absurd detail amid the apocalypse. No one dared ask if she was afraid. She seemed to have left fear behind. At noon, the noise of fighting intensified. The Soviets had reached the Reichstag, and the red flag waved over the building. In the bunker, officers reported the news with broken voices. Hitler merely nodded. There was no rage or surprise, only a heavy silence. Then, without lifting his gaze, he issued his final order. Their bodies must not fall into enemy hands. They were to be cremated immediately, without witnesses, without photographs. It was his way of ensuring his end would not become a trophy. Shortly after 3 in the afternoon, the Führer and Eva Braun retired to their private room. No one accompanied them. The door closed with a dry sound that echoed along the corridor. Outside, the aides waited in silence. Some cried without making a sound. Others stood still, eyes fixed on the floor. Eternal minutes passed. Then a small crack was heard, followed by a metallic, acrid smell that mixed with the corridor's air. No one needed to ask. The end had come. When the aides entered, they found Eva Braun reclining on the sofa, her face calm, as if asleep. Beside her, Hitler lay collapsed, a pistol in his right hand, blood staining the carpet. The scene was silent, almost theatrical. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, obeying prior instructions, they wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them to the Chancellery garden, and set them alight with gasoline. Outside, the sky was still covered with smoke, and the flames devouring the regime's remains blended with those of the entire city. In that instant, the echo of 12 years of terror and propaganda went out. The man who had unleashed the most devastating war in history was reduced to ashes in a bombed garden. No army, no conspiracy, no enemy had defeated him. He had condemned himself. It was the absolute collapse of the myth, the consummation of power destroying itself from within when it has no one left to dominate. Inside the bunker, the news spread like a whisper. No one shouted. No one celebrated. Some crossed themselves. Others collapsed in silence. Goebbels, pale, declared he would follow his leader's example. Magda, with tears in her eyes, embraced her children one by one. In the corridors, the secretaries looked at each other without knowing what to do. The war still roared outside, but within reigned an almost sacred silence, a macabre calm that only accompanies endings. The following hours were confused. Some officers tried to organize a partial surrender. Others planned to escape through Soviet lines. Martin Bormann drafted radio messages reporting Hitler's death, though most were never received. In the tunnels connecting the chancellery to the subway, isolated shots echoed, distant voices, contradictory orders. No one knew who commanded anymore. Power had died along with its owner. Meanwhile, above ground, the Soviets kept advancing. Each building taken was one step closer to the end. Fire consumed what little remained standing. Survivors wandered aimlessly among the rubble, unaware that at that very moment, a few meters beneath their feet, Germany's fate had just been sealed. With Hitler's death, the Third Reich ceased to exist. There was no formal surrender, no speeches, no flags lowered. Only silence, smoke, and the persistent smell of gasoline. The empire that had promised 1,000 years of glory had lasted barely 12, and its end was not a heroic act, but a flight into nothingness. Even so, for those who were there, time seemed to stop. No one knew what would come next. The sound of explosions once again filled the air, and Berlin's sky kept burning, as if the city itself needed to purge what had happened. Inside the bunker, the few who remained lit candles, drank what wine was left, and awaited the inevitable arrival of the Red Army. In the hours that followed, history would take a definitive turn. Without a leader, without command, and without purpose, Nazi Germany would collapse completely, handing its executioners the ruins of a sick dream. Because when power commits suicide, what it leaves behind is not silence, but a void that history will fill with memory. May 1st, 1945 dawned with a glow that didn't seem natural. Over Berlin, smoke formed a thick vault that blurred the sunlight, tinting it with reddish and golden hues. It was a strange dawn, beautiful and tragic at once, as if the sky wished to mirror the fire still burning in the city's entrails. After weeks of darkness, the German capital awoke to a different silence. Not the tense silence of waiting, but the silence of the end. During the night, the last pockets of resistance had been crushed. The echo of combat had faded little by little, like a breath going out. The Soviets controlled almost the entire center, and German units surrendered in small groups, exhausted, covered in dust, with the empty gaze of those who have seen too much. The Reichstag, symbol of political power, was now a blackened ruin. Atop its half-destroyed dome waved a red flag. That image, captured by Soviet photographers, would become one of the most powerful symbols of the 20th century. The victory over Nazism, the end of the totalitarian dream, the assertion that, for at least an instant, history had regained its balance. In the streets, Soviet soldiers advanced cautiously among the rubble. Some greeted civilians, others simply looked around with hard, distrustful expressions. The stench of death was unbearable. At every step they found remnants of fighting, bodies beneath the debris, charred tanks. On the sidewalks, survivors watched the parade of the new power with a mixture of fear and relief. For many, those men in dusty uniforms were liberators. For others, the face of the enemy. But all knew the world had changed forever. An old woman who had spent weeks hiding in a basement in the Mitte district would recall years later that dawn. When I came out, the air smelled of iron and ash. Everything was gray, except the sky. And in the middle of the smoke, I saw the red flag. I felt neither hatred nor joy, only weariness. It was as if the soul of the city were empty, Red Army soldiers raised their flag not only over the Reichstag, but over bridges, government buildings, the devastated neighborhoods. It was a symbolic, almost ceremonial gesture. The conquest of Berlin was not a clean victory. It was a monumental sacrifice. Nearly 80,000 Soviet soldiers died in the final assault, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded. German losses were impossible to count. Soldiers, civilians, children. Berlin was, literally, a mass grave. Even so, among the ruins, life began to stir. The first civilians emerged from shelters with uncertain steps. Some wore blankets over their shoulders. Others pushed wheelbarrows with their few belongings. They sought water, food, news. In many districts, running water no longer worked, and people drank from puddles or from the Tiergarten ponds, contaminated and coated with ash. Improvised hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors tended the wounded without medicines, using sewing thread in place of sutures. And yet, amid the disaster, the mere act of keeping on breathing felt like a form of rebirth. Chaos did not end with the arrival of the Red Army. On the contrary, another stage of horror began, more diffuse, more human. Revenge and abuses spread through the city. Many women were victims of mass rape, and thousands of families were marked by that trauma for generations. The victors, hardened by 4 years of brutal war, vented on the German population all the rage they had stored up. It was the price of victory, a justice warped by pain. In the testimonies gathered afterward, the words repeat again and again: fear, silence, shame. But there were gestures of compassion too. Some Soviet officers tried to protect civilians, distributed bread, organized patrols to prevent looting. Not all were executioners. Many were young peasants or students who had never been in a foreign city. Their faces, hardened by war, showed the same weariness as the Berliners. In the nights that followed, some shared cigarettes or songs, without understanding each other's language, but recognizing one another by their fatigue. The war had ended for them, though they did not yet know how to return to life. Survivors began to rebuild their days with what remained. They searched for their relatives among the rubble, buried their dead in yards and parks, improvised kitchens atop the debris. Some hung strips of white cloth in their windows as a sign of surrender and hope. In certain neighborhoods, children played among the remains of tanks, unaware of the magnitude of the disaster. Their laughter, however brief, sounded like the first melody after a long, dark silence. The dawn of May 2nd brought the official surrender. In Soviet headquarters, the last German representatives signed the document that ended the battle for Berlin. Days still remained before the Reich's total capitulation, but the city had already fallen. Soviet radios broadcast the news to Moscow, where the bells rang for hours. Stalin had kept his promise. Berlin was his. Yet for Berliners, victory had a bitter taste. The regime had vanished, but what remained was a dead city, an undone society, a people who had to learn to survive without ideals and without faith. The streets were covered in dust and silence. In the nights that followed, improvised bonfires lit the squares. People gathered around the fire to share stories, food, or simply company. No one spoke of politics. No one pronounced Hitler's name. They spoke only of the immediate future: how to get bread, how to find the missing, how to go on. The Soviet photographers who roamed the city left a record of that landscape. Women with expressionless faces, bearded men walking among ruins, barefoot children holding pieces of bread. And in the background, the monumental ruins of the Reichstag, the symbol of an era that had ended. In one of those photographs, a group of women sweeps the remains of a destroyed street. In the midst of devastation, that everyday act of cleaning seems an act of faith, because rebuilding, in that context, was not only about raising walls, it was about believing that life could still have meaning. Berlin had been conquered, but in a way it had also been freed. The ideological chains that had held it captive for more than a decade disintegrated along with its buildings. What remained was an empty space, a blank page that time would set about rewriting. The city, mutilated and blackened, breathed again, though every breath hurt. The red dawn of that May 1st was, in essence, a paradox. The end and the beginning, death and the seed of memory. From the ruins, a new world began to hint at itself, still clumsy, still full of shadows. But in that faint light filtered through the smoke, there was something profoundly human, the desire to keep existing. Because when the fire goes out and the ash settles, what remains is the voice of those who survived to tell it. When the roar of the guns finally died away, it was not the silence of peace that arrived, but the silence of bewilderment. Berlin hung suspended between smoke and disbelief, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. Buildings still smoldered. The ground remained covered with glass and rubble, and the air was so saturated with ash it seemed even breathing was heavy. Survivors slowly came out of shelters, shielding their eyes from the light. It was the first true dawn after weeks of darkness, but the city they found was no longer the one they remembered. Along the streets walked silent figures, dressed in torn clothing and faces without expression. Some stopped before the remains of what had been their home. Others searched for names among collapsed walls. On every corner there was a halted story, a fragment of life buried beneath bricks. The war had ended, yes, but Berlin's soul seemed suspended in a kind of inner fog. No one knew how to speak of what had happened. Words, like buildings, had collapsed. From among the survivors would emerge, with the passing years, the witnesses who would allow us to reconstruct that instant when the world split in two. They were men and women who wrote in diaries, on scraps of paper, in letters that never arrived, or simply kept their memories until someone was willing to listen. And although their voices are different, they all share the same tone, a mixture of astonishment, shame, and endurance. One of those voices was that of Marta Hillers, a Berlin journalist who left a harrowing testimony in her anonymous diary, published decades later under the title A Woman in Berlin. In its pages, she recounts the daily life of women during the Soviet occupation. Hunger, fear, humiliations. She writes with lucid coolness, as if the only way to survive were to look horror in the face. "Shame has disappeared," she wrote. "There's no room for it when what's at stake is life." Her words, simple and direct, reveal an aspect that figures and official reports could never convey. War is not measured only in the dead, but in the way it breaks the dignity of the living. Other testimonies come from soldiers, both German and Soviet. The young Hans Beck, recruited at 17 for the Volkssturm, wrote in a letter he never managed to send, "We fight for a country that no longer exists. With each passing day, I feel less hatred and more weariness. Perhaps the enemy is not across the river, but inside us." Those lines, found among the rubble of a shelter, sum up the disillusionment of a whole generation raised in obedience and hurled into the absurd. On the other side, Soviet soldiers also left their own words, many of them collected by the journalist Vasily Grossman, who accompanied the Red Army to Berlin. In his notebook, he wrote, "There is no joy in this victory, only weariness. We have destroyed evil, but looking around, I feel that evil has passed through us too." That phrase, written by one of the war's most lucid chroniclers, reveals the human price victory demanded of all, without exception. As years passed, Berliners' memories took on the texture of a collective memory. Diaries, photographs, fragments of correspondence, medical reports, and confessions interwove into a mosaic of voices. Thanks to them, we can hear today the intimate heartbeat of those days, beyond politics and military strategy. In every testimony, there is a desperate attempt to understand how something so monstrous could occur in the very heart of Europe. But there is something else that unites all those accounts: the omnipresence of silence. Not only the silence of the ruins, but the later silence, that of the years when speaking was dangerous or impossible. Many survivors were silent for decades. In the divided Germany that arose after the war, remembering became a political matter. In the East, memory had to serve the narrative of anti-fascism. In the West, it had to facilitate the moral reconstruction of the country. But between one discourse and the other, personal memories were trapped. What was truly lived in Berlin in 1945, hunger, fear, rapes, shame, had no place in monuments or official commemorations. That is why, when diaries and memoirs finally began to be published, they did so with an almost volcanic force. It was the eruption of the repressed, the testimony of a generation that had learned to survive without speaking. And in that recovery of voice, Berlin began, slowly, to recognize itself. In many of those texts, the most moving thing is not the description of horror, but the persistence of humanity amid chaos. A nurse at the Charité hospital wrote, "We healed without instruments, without anesthesia, without light." But sometimes a hand on the forehead was enough for a wounded man to stop trembling. In those days, comfort was a form of medicine. That sentence, seemingly simple, distills the spirit of those who managed to hold on to something like hope among the ruins. There are the photographs too, mute but eloquent. Images taken by Soviet soldiers or by the first Allied journalists show faces that seem carved from stone. Women walking among rubble with heads held high, barefoot children playing among destroyed tanks, old men sweeping what is left of their homes. They are images without dramatics, without adornment, and perhaps for that reason, they are so powerful. In them, tragedy ceases to be epic and becomes everyday. Over time, those witnesses of silence became involuntary guardians of memory. Thanks to them, the world could look again toward Berlin not only as a symbol of horror, but also as a place of learning. The words of those who survived remind us that history is not a line of victories and defeats, but an immense weave of human voices struggling not to be forgotten. Today, as we walk through the rebuilt city, it is almost impossible to imagine the landscape those witnesses described. Where there were mountains of ruins, there are glass buildings. Where cannons sounded, there are cafes and trams. But beneath those modern streets, beneath the foundations of the new Berlin, the echo still dwells of those who saw the world burn and yet decided to tell it. The silence of those days is no longer just a memory. It is a warning. A voice whispering that civilization, even at its brightest moment, can fall if it forgets to listen to those who suffer. Because every rebuilt city keeps in its foundations the memory of what it was, and Berlin still had to learn to live split in two. When the dust of war finally began to settle, Berlin was turned into a landscape that seemed more a memory than a city. From the air, the German capital was an endless expanse of ruins. Avenues split open, entire blocks reduced to dust, rivers of rubble where once there had been neighborhoods, markets, and parks. In the center, the Reichstag's dome, blackened by fire, stood like the skeleton of an extinguished civilization. The silence that followed the explosions was not calm, but vertigo, the sensation of staring into an abyss and not knowing how to begin to fill it. The months after the surrender were ones of absolute disorganization. The city was occupied by 4 victorious armies, the Soviet, the American, the British, and the French, and each claimed its share of the spoils and its own way of understanding peace. Berlin became a laboratory of the post-war world, the place where the victorious powers would measure their strength, no longer with guns, but with ideologies. On one side, Communism promised social justice and state control. On the other, liberal democracy and the open market. In the middle, the exhausted Berliners, who only wanted to survive the reconstruction of the world. During the first months, the city had no government, no stable currency, no basic services. The streets were riddled with mines and debris. Hunger was an everyday presence. People bartered cigarettes for bread, watches for potatoes, jackets for coal. Soviet soldiers controlled the East, the Western Allies, the West. But between one zone and the other, the border was still porous, invisible, a line one could cross on foot, with a gesture or with silence. No one imagined that, with time, that line would turn into a scar of concrete and wire. In that scene of devastation, German women, the so-called Trümmerfrauen, women of the rubble, became the symbol of civil resistance. With shovels, wheelbarrows, and bare hands, they began to clear the streets stone by stone. For hours, under rain or sun, they raised walls and sorted reusable bricks. Their work was not only physical, it was a way to return dignity to a humiliated city. In photographs of those years, they appear covered in dust, faces weathered, but with an almost solemn determination. They were the true architects of the German rebirth, those who turned the ruins into the foundations of a new life. Yet the material reconstruction could not hide the political fracture that grew each day. In 1948, tensions between the Soviets and the Western Allies reached a critical point. Stalin ordered the total blockade of West Berlin, cutting the supply of food, coal, and electricity. The city, left isolated within the eastern zone, seemed condemned to starve. But what followed was one of the most impressive episodes of modern solidarity, the Berlin airlift. For almost a year, British and American planes flew over the city day and night, landing at Tempelhof and Gatow airfields loaded with tons of provisions and medicines. In the skies, the sound of engines became a new form of hope. Children called them candy bombers because the pilots dropped small packets of sweets tied with handkerchiefs before landing. It was a titanic effort, a peaceful battle won with air and patience. When the blockade ended, West Berlin had survived thanks to the collective will of those who refused to kneel again. But the price of that survival was the definitive division. In 1949, the world awoke to a new reality. Two Germanys. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, under the aegis of the United States and its allies. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, under Moscow's control. Berlin, though located entirely within the Eastern Territory, was divided as well. It was a geographic and political paradox, a city split into four sectors, where the border was not a natural line, but an open wound through the middle of the streets. For a time, coexistence held with an appearance of normality. Trams crossed from one side to the other. Berliners could work in the West and sleep in the East. But distrust grew, fed by economic differences, propaganda systems, and fear. In the early 50s, tens of thousands fled each month from east to west, seeking freedom or simply a better life. The Soviet authorities and the GDR government saw it as an intolerable exodus. The response came at dawn on August 13, 1961, when troops began to raise a wall. In a matter of hours, Berlin was physically split in two. Streets that had once joined neighborhoods were blinded by concrete walls, barbed wire, and watchtowers. Entire families were separated. Friends, lovers, and neighbors were trapped on opposite sides. The Berlin Wall did not only divide a city, it divided the century. On one side, the promise of progress and consumption. On the other, the utopia of controlled equality. In between, the daily life of those who only wanted to cross the street to hug someone. The images from the first days of the wall are almost unbearably sad. In a famous photograph, an Eastern soldier leaps the wire and lands on the Western side, face tense, body suspended between two worlds. In another, a woman tosses a bouquet of flowers across the border to her sister. Berlin became the mirror of the Cold War, a stage where fear and hope lived a few meters apart. Despite repression and surveillance, the city did not stop beating. In the years that followed, West Berlin became a symbol of cultural resistance, a refuge for artists, thinkers, and young people seeking freedom. On the eastern side, life continued at a grayer rhythm, marked by propaganda and scarcity, but also by the solidarity of those who learned to survive in the system's fissures. The two Berlins created distinct identities, two ways of understanding life under the same sky. As time passed, the border became more than a wall. It was a collective scar. Those who had lived through the war now saw their city fragment again, this time not by bombs, but by ideas. The memory of the fire of 1945 mingled with the glare of the floodlights illuminating the border strip at night. History, it seemed, insisted on repeating itself, though with other weapons. Yet nothing is eternal. Generations changed, ideals wore down, and cracks began to appear in the wall's foundations as well. What had been born of fear began to crack under the desire for freedom. Berlin, once more, was destined to be the stage for a rebirth. Because at the bottom of every division, the possibility of reunion always beats. On November 9th, 1989, Berlin again became the center of the world. 44 years after its destruction, the city awoke from its long lethargy to the most unexpected sound of all. Not sirens nor gunfire, nor orders shouted in the dark, but the growing murmur of a crowd approaching a wall to tear it down with their hands. That night there were no bombs or armies, only ordinary citizens pushing history forward. And although the years had changed streets and faces, the essence was the same, a city's will to breathe again as a single body. For days, tensions had been rising in the east. International pressure, protests, and the regime's exhaustion had undermined the GDR's foundations. News spread by word of mouth, Western stations filtered into home radios, and people began to gather before border crossings without knowing exactly what would happen. On the afternoon of that November 9th, a government spokesman made a historic mistake. He announced, confusingly, that citizens of East Germany could travel freely to the West immediately. That phrase, uttered without planning, was the trigger. Thousands of people began to move. Men, women, children, and the elderly walked under the drizzle, some carrying flowers, others cameras, many simply empty hands. The border guards, disoriented, didn't know what to do. For years they had been trained to shoot at any escape attempt, but that night the enemy didn't come running or hidden. They came walking with heads held high. At the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, the crowd began to shout, "Open the gates!" And near midnight, the soldier Harald Jäger, without clear orders, made a decision that would change the course of history. He lifted the barrier. What followed was a human tide. Thousands crossed to the other side amid hugs, tears, and incredulous laughter. The inhabitants of West Berlin came out to receive them, offering champagne, flowers, music. On the wall, people began striking the concrete with hammers, picks, stones, even bare hands. Each fragment that fell was an intimate victory, a way to expel the ghosts of the past. Television cameras captured the moment, broadcasting to the entire world the image of a city that, for the first time in half a century, was becoming one again. The air that night had a different texture. Witnesses remember a smell of damp, of old dust, but also an electric feeling, as if the air itself vibrated with a promise. Some touched the wall with their fingertips before breaking it, as if they needed to make sure it was real. Others sat atop it, sharing cigarettes, songs, and flags. No one gave orders, no one obeyed. It was pure spontaneity, freedom in its most tangible and most fragile form. Berlin, the city that had been the symbol of total power, terror, and division, now became the emblem of reunion. That night, the echoes of the past seemed to resound among the wall's debris. The footsteps of the soldiers of 1945, the cries of refugees in tunnels, the prayers murmured in air raid shelters. Everything returned, but transformed. Where once there had been fear, there was now laughter. Where there had been walls, now there were embraces. History, for once, seemed to offer closure. For many, the wall's fall was also an emotional awakening. People born separated discovered that the other side was not the enemy, but a reflection of themselves. A woman from the East embraced her sister from the West after 30 years of separation and said, "I thought I wouldn't remember your smell." A man, tears in his eyes, knelt before the rubble and picked up a piece of concrete as if it were a relic. Improvised vendors began offering fragments of the wall in little plastic bags, and each was a tangible testimony to a modern miracle. In the days that followed, the city filled with music. Guitars and drums occupied spaces where once there had been watchtowers. Artists painted murals on the remnants of the wall, transforming gray concrete into a canvas of vivid colors. People danced on the rubble, and the streets filled with life again, as if Berlin had been holding its breath for decades and suddenly exhaled all the accumulated air. Yet beneath the euphoria, a shadow persisted. Reunification would not be simple. There were invisible wounds that could not be erased with hugs or songs. Two systems, two ways of understanding life, now faced the task of coexisting. Years of separation had left scars in memory, in the economy, in culture. Many in the East felt lost in the new order. Many in the West did not know how to receive them. Freedom had arrived, but so had uncertainty. History once again collected its price. Even so, November 9th was etched in the world's memory as an unrepeatable night. It was not only the fall of a physical wall, but the collapse of an entire era. The Cold War, nuclear fear, the division of Europe. In a few hours, newscasts showed images of crowds dancing on the concrete, and in homes across the planet, people wept without quite knowing why. It was the emotion of seeing, at last, that history could be guided by hope, and not only by fear. Over time, Berlin rebuilt itself again. Not with the bricks of the past, but with a different will. The city became a symbol of reconciliation, a space where art, memory, and everyday life coexist upon the traces of tragedy. In the places where there were once walls, there are now parks, cafes, museums. And in the ground, a line of cobblestones traces the exact path of the old wall, reminding us that the division existed, that it was real, but that it was also overcome. Each year, when the anniversary of that night arrives, thousands gather before the Brandenburg Gate. Some are witnesses from then, others, young people who know the story only from books or screens. Candles are lit, images projected, songs heard, and when the clock strikes midnight, the crowd keeps a minute of silence. Not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. Respect for those who suffered, those who fell, those who survived. Respect for a city that knew how to reinvent itself as many times as it was destroyed. Today, when one walks through Berlin at dusk, it is easy to forget what it was. The lights, the trams, the conversations in cafes, everything seems so normal that it is hard to imagine that, beneath those cobblestones, lies the history of the century. But if one stops for a moment and listens, one can still sense something. An echo, a sigh, a faint vibration in the air. It is the voice of the past, which claims neither tears nor glory, only memory. Because the last night in Berlin before the end of the world was not just a date, but a cycle. A journey that began in the ruins of fear and ended in the tremor of hope. And though the years keep passing, the city seems to whisper, every time night falls, remember, because only those who remember can begin again. Because every story that ends always leaves, in its last breath, the silent announcement of a new beginning. We have traveled together through the shadows and lights of a city that was reborn as many times as it fell. Among ruins, voices, and memories, we discovered that even at the end of the world, a new beginning can be born. If anything in this story made you think or feel, I would love to read you in the comments. Rest now, and let Berlin keep dreaming in your memory. Good night.